Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Lumenii webinar on succession planning. So I will give the audience a few seconds to join. Thank you for spending the next hour with us. And while we are waiting to get started, please do, in the chat box, let us know where you are dialing in from. So like I said, thank you for spending time with us today. Today's topic is all about succession planning and how to develop technical talent into high-performing leaders. So we have presented in webinars on succession planning a few times in the past, but today's topic really came about because we engage with organizations from the technical professional space who often will promote their top performing technical people into management positions. And what we see in a lot of our experience is that they make these promotions without necessarily giving their technical specialists the tools that they need to shift into a leadership mindset. So, as we know, becoming a leader requires a change in work, a change in people management, a change in delegation, and operating more strategically. And when people are not necessarily equipped for that, then we come in and we look at it retroactively. So what we would like to do today is talk about this and give you some best practices and some tips on how to deal with this more proactively. So my name is Caitlin Quibell. I am a senior psychologist at Lumenii, and I will be playing the role of the facilitator today in the webinar. I am stepping into the shoes of Jayendra Naidu, our director, who unfortunately is not well this morning, and so I will be filling his rather large shoes, and let's hope I can do a good job. I am joined by Tato Matlala. Tato has over 2 decades of experience working in the people space and previously working at organizations such as Virgin Active and Uber, currently heading up her own organization, Pink Onion Africa, as the owner and Chief Talent and Strategy Officer. So thank you for joining us today, Tato, and sharing your knowledge with us.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me, Caitlin. I appreciate everybody's time. Thank you.
Thanks, Tato. We're also joined on our panel of experts by Lashen Mudli-Singh. Lashen is the Chief HR Officer at Right to Care. Right to Care is a non-profit that works across South Africa and Africa, helping to bring together governments and communities to find innovative solutions to public health care issues such as HIV and AIDS. So thank you for your time this morning, Lashen.
Thank you, Caitlin, and I look forward to an engaging discussion with the rest of the panel and participants.
Thank you. And then Alvin Meyer, my colleague from Lumenii, is also part of our panel. So Alvin has nearly 15 years of experience in the area of talent management and consulting, having worked with organizations across South Africa and Africa on large-scale projects, for example, in succession planning and development. So he's going to be sharing some best practices with us today. How are you today, Alvin?
Thanks, Caitlin. Very well, and good morning, everybody. It's awesome to be here on the call with you.
Great. So to very briefly take you through the agenda for our discussion, each of our panel members is going to share some of their experiences in a short presentation, starting with Tato, speaking about practical learnings on what drives leadership performance in technical specialists. Thereafter, Lashen will share more about how to mitigate succession planning risks in a technical environment. And finally, Alvin will share some of his best practices when it comes to succession planning with a lens on, technical specialists. We like to keep the most time in our session devoted to an interactive Q&A session where our panel members will answer your questions. So we have received a number of questions beforehand, and we will also ask for you to share live questions with us in the Q&A and in the chat. So please feel free to engage, ask questions. We will endeavor to answer as many as we can in the session. And even if we don't answer your question, we will endeavor to give you an answer after the session. And then one last point from me, we will have a competition running where the best question, the best comment, and the most interactive delegate will receive a Take-A-Lot voucher. So like I said, please feel free to interact with one another and to share your questions and comments with the panelists. So I'm going to hand over to Tato first. Thank you, Tato.
Thank you, Caitlin. Is the floor, the virtual floor mine now?
Yes, you can take it away.
Awesome, thank you. So to everybody who's here, yesterday, when I was thinking about our conversation today, what came to my mind was dating and how succession planning really, really feels like dating. And in South Africa, we call that mojolo. So I kind of want to anchor that as my story to start as the basis, as the foundation. So we've all at some point in our lives either been in relationships or dating, or and we know that it takes two to tango. So when it comes to succession planning, it's similar. It starts with an organization having a purpose and why it exists in the market, and what is it that the organization has to do for society in this market. So that's where everything starts. And then it has a human being on the other side who is as complex as the market is, as complex as the organization is, by mere fact that they are a human being. They have a brain, and we know how complex the brain is as a system. So you have two complex systems here. One is a human, and one is an organization. And together, they have to perform the role that the organization has said, this is our purpose in society, and this is why we have a company that exists. So we don't employ anybody because we know them, because we like them. We employ people to fulfill a specific purpose for the organization in this role. So before a person comes in, a role has to exist. And a role exists by design because there are critical things that the role has to accomplish in order for the business to succeed. And that we call the performance relationship. So long story short, the dating of an organization and an employee, the outcome of it is performance. And so everything that we do rests on the promise that we make to each other for performance in contracts, in psychological contracts, but that performance requires a person to show up. It requires the organization to show up, and both these complex entities to cultivate an environment and a culture that is going to have them both succeed in this relationship. And this is where now what you are seeing on screen makes sense. So I'm going to start with now the human. The organization is there. It exists. It's clear what the organization does, whether it manufactures toothpaste, whether it manufactures oil and gas. The fact is that the organization is there and it has a purpose. And somebody now comes back and says, well, my personal values as a human being, my motivations, my strengths, my interests kind of align with what the purpose of this organization does. But more so, the job description and how the role has been advertised speaks to me. So to everybody who's responsible for designing job descriptions, your dating with your people starts there. It is important that you write your job descriptions in the manner that when a human being who has a brain, who has emotions, who has interests and motivations and strengths can identify, and they can see themselves putting in the effort, putting in the time to do the work that is going to help us achieve our purpose as an organization. So it's really important. And I'm sitting on this. I haven't spoken about succession because this is where everything starts. But once we then have the person who says, it aligns with me, this role speaks to who I am, I can see myself growing, I can see myself being here for the next 5 years, I can see myself getting married and having babies or traveling the world and still contributing to the purpose and to the mission of this organization. And this is where your culture comes in. The culture keeps the people there. The culture keeps my motivations as a human being there. the strategy and the amount of change that happens and how we handle change, all of those things that happen day to day keep the person there, but their own innate motivations and interests and strengths will then determine how they want to move and succeed. And this is where then succession comes in. So I came in a technical role. I grew my love for this business because I understand the higher purpose that it has and I can connect with it. Now, as we grow as a business, we are needing people to grow with us. And we know that a human being, as a complex being, they don't change as quick, as fast as the market does and as the company does. And this is where now it's important that we understand who is going to succeed in what role, what are our critical roles, how do we build bench strength to make sure that as we grow and as we change, we have the right capabilities, we have the right people leading other people, not necessarily managing them, and we have the right people managing the resources. So, Caitlin, I'm not gonna speak a lot about the practical things. I'm sure we will touch on that during the session, but I just wanted to introduce the whole concept. Why do we even bother to do succession? We do succession because companies need to grow. Change happens every day and people must grow. So how do we take people from technical specialists into people leaders? Self-awareness is the biggest. That is the first and the most critical. From self-awareness, we move to self-mastery. We cannot do self-awareness without talent assessments, and I'm sure we will speak a lot about them in this. So we have talent assessments that will help us understand potential, that will help us understand personality, that will help us marry the personality of the person, their motivations, their interests, their strengths, together with where we are wanting or seeing the role moving into. And then we have talent assessments to assist us with that. And beyond talent assessments, then we work with the human being to become more self-aware. Who are they as a human being, as a person? Who are they as a technical specialist, and who could they be as a leader of other people? And this is where then the succession planning comes in, and we will chat about that in the session. Caitlin, I'd like to kind of stop here. I know that I have still 2 minutes, but I'd like the 2 minutes to give it back to the audience so that they can think about what I said. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tato. Appreciate your insights, and we're having a lot of questions coming in from our audience, so some exciting things to get to. I just want to reflect on this. If I look at this model, what it says to me is that, we can look at potential as one part of the lens when we want to develop technical specialists into leaders. But beyond the potential, which needs to be in place, we also need to consider the human catalysts and the organizational catalysts. So what's going on within that individual? Do they have the drive to make this development journey, as well as what's going on in the organization, and does the culture and strategy support, the development journey that we're taking them on? So yeah, really excellent reflections there. Thank you. All right, I'm going to ask Lashen to switch your camera on. Thank you very much. And I'll hand over the floor to you just to discuss mitigating succession risks within a technical environment such as right to care.
Thanks, Caitlin. And Tato, very interesting analogy of the dating scene when it comes to the employee relationship. I also reflected on today's presentation and kind of thought what practical scenario in my life can be associated to something similar when it comes to succession planning. And I shared with Caitlin yesterday a video about cat herding, a job not heard of in many cases, but it hits home because anyone that knows me personally knows that I'm a lover of cats, and as a hobby, I breed British Shorthairs and Scottish Folds. So similarly, our cats have a mind of their own, and so do our employees. It is about the manager having the frank discussions with the employee to determine which direction the employee wants to go in. So as much as we could be a technical expert and outperforming in our current role, it does not mean that my career goal is wanting to succeed to the next level, and I'm comfortable where I am. So we need to be cognizant of where the person is in the organization and what their future goals are. More importantly, in today's rapid evolving world, where the pace of technology advancements is relentless, it is more than crucial to prepare for the future. Succession planning is a process of identifying and developing future leaders within the organization to ensure the continued operative effectiveness, even in the absence of key personnel. It is in a highly technical environment where specialized skills and knowledge is indispensable. The risk associated with poor succession planning can be particularly damaging. And I come from an NGO that is medically orientated, so dealing with doctors, nurses, but not just your ordinary GP, but experts in their fields when it comes to HIV, TB, AIDS, and non-communicable diseases. And now the new buzzword being One Health. The skill set in South Africa is limited. And therefore, if we want to succeed in the arena that we are in, how do we identify individuals and key personnel that can fulfill what our vision and mission is for the next 5 or 10 years? One of the key risks in succession planning within a technical setting is the loss of critical expertise. Technical roles are often require a niche skill and a deep knowledge of the actual area of expertise, and this can take years to acquire. If technical personnel leave without well-prepared successor in place, it can lead to significant disruptions in operation, delays in our projects, and even loss in competitive advantage. And very often companies fall into the trap of identifying their top 10, 20 key personnel, which often sit at top and senior management. And these successes for these roles come from our middle management. Very often we neglect to find a plan or put a plan in place to ensure that once these middle managers succeed to our senior management or top management levels, how do we fill that gap? Because clearly they had a productive role to play in the organization, and we're actually forming a vacuum if we do not look at succession planning holistically. To mitigate this risk in organizations operating in highly technical environments should adopt a proactive approach. These are to ensure that positions are essential. Firstly, you will need to identify your technical roles and which are the key technical roles. By identifying critical roles within your organization, you'll be able to essentially plan for smooth functioning of your technical operations. You develop a talent pipeline. Once you've identified key roles, focus on developing a talent pipeline to ensure the steady supply of qualified candidates who can step into the roles when needed. This could involve investing in training and development programs, mentoring initiatives, and cross-training opportunities. In Right to Care, for example, we run internships and learnerships. Whilst this is not our core business, we have identified that this does fill a need when it comes to expert skills and developing them. The advantage of running learnerships and internships in your country, you also acquaint the staff to the culture of the company, which is very important in terms of a fit for purpose and finding the right candidate to fit the roles that become available in the future. Encourage knowledge sharing, promote culture of knowledge sharing within the technical teams, encourage teams members to document their process, share best practice, and collaborate on projects. This not only helps spread expertise across the organization, but also ensures that knowledge is not siloed with individual employees. So in Right to Care, we look at things such as having an open day where different projects, so we are grant funded and we have different projects within the organization. Leads within these projects come together on one day to share their experiences, failures, successes, and technical skills. So therefore, we are providing a platform for people to share their knowledge. This can also be done as paper bag sessions and during lunchtime, a 1-hour session where you're basically discussing a technical issue that is facing the company, or actually encouraging people to share their skills and expertise with others in the company. Conduct regular skills assessment. This is very important in determining skills gaps and areas of improvement. This information can help you tailor your training and development initiatives. So your annual training development plan, report that you send to your seaters, etc., should inform you on what the year ahead is going to look like in terms of training and development and taking succession into account. Succession planning should be an ongoing process. So it is not a one-time event or just a paper exercise. It should be ongoing, dynamic, and process that adapts to the changing needs of and evolving technology landscapes. So we can't be stuck on what we decided last year is what's going to work this year. We might have to adapt our plan and therefore regularly review and update our succession plans to ensure that we remain relevant and effective. In conclusion, the mitigating succession planning risk in a highly technical environment requires foresight, planning, and a commitment, especially from top and senior management, to develop your talent pipeline. If you do not have the buy-in from top management, no matter how good your succession planning policy is on paper, it will never be fruitful and have a return on investment. By identifying key roles, developing talent pipeline, encouraging knowledge sharing, conducting regular skills assessments, and treating succession planning as an ongoing process, you can ensure that your organization is well prepared to navigate the challenges of the future. There's quite a few questions that we received with regard to the actual risk and getting buy-in from management, but I would leave that for the question and answer session, Caitlin, when we deal with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lashen. I think some excellent points there that relate to the need to be proactive and to think about these issues in advance instead of looking at them reactively once we have people in positions that maybe they don't have the right skill sets for, and looking at gathering that data to inform decisions. Yeah, so we have had a number of questions on, well, how do we identify readiness? As you say, how do we get buy-in? So we will definitely look at answering some of those in the Q&A. Alvin, can I hand over to you?
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Caitlin, and thanks, Tato and Lashen. I found your presentations illuminating. Yeah, thanks, everybody. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share some best practices that work in relation to succession planning this morning. It's a topic I'm super passionate about. It's a topic I think we do very well at Lumenii. And I'm passionate about it because it has a profound compounding effect on so many people's lives. Getting it right in a business means that you have the right person in the right role at the right time. And that can have a significant multiplier effect to all the people who report into that person. So based on our experience, there's 5 key elements to effective succession planning. And it's really quite simple. It's about identifying mission-critical roles, pinpointing what success looks like in those roles, measuring performance and potential of what's typically a long list of successes in terms of those success criteria, and then selecting really feasible successes for those particular roles. And once you've done that, you can drive development in a highly personalized and focused way. So these 5 steps are likely to promote successful delivery of a project. But a top, and I've seen the question pop up in the group, is that by designing your project around these elements and thinking through each of these elements before you even start, you are going to put yourself in a really good position to develop a budget, which is absolutely key for the project, and to be able to get or obtain top management buy-in, because you can give everybody a clear picture of the process that you are going to follow. Okay, so the first step, which is identifying your mission-critical roles, is really about starting the journey on the right foot. Okay, essentially what you need is a list of mission critical roles to develop succession plans for. So as this picture suggests, you need to really look ahead to determine which roles are going to actually deliver strategic impact and operational continuity. And you need to be comfortable that your list may evolve as the business context changes and in line with market demands. So we're looking for roles that drive strategy. We're looking for roles that will ensure business continuity. And we would humbly like to suggest that you don't just focus on senior management roles here, which is a trap that we can fall into. There may be other really important mission critical roles, oftentimes in the sales space or product development space, or they could be integrator roles in the business that are really important. Another important comment here is that the role might not exist in your current structure. In fact, it might not even exist in the common kind of marketplace lexicon of roles. If you take a chief data officer, for example, or an AI ethicist, those are roles which I don't think a lot of us would have been focusing on even 2 years ago, but that are likely to form part of somebody's succession plans in a business that uses data to drive its strategy. Okay, so once you've reflected on these points, you can develop a really concise list of mission critical roles to focus in on. And a top tip here, I've seen companies who do this stage really well employ this method, is to classify your organizational roles, and that might be from the C band and above, for example, if you think Patterson grading, in terms of their strategic impact, the effect they have on operational continuity, and also to pick up on something Lashen said earlier, the supply in the market. Roles where there's really scarce technical skills might be roles that you need to prioritize in your process. Okay. All right, step 2, as this picture suggests, is about zooming in and out to the role. Essentially, what you're looking for is a really clear framework of success criteria per mission critical role. And these need to be future orientated, take account of any relevant performance benchmarks, and be behavioral and technical in nature. Okay. But it's important to ask yourself whether performance is really a predictor of success in the target succession role, or just a ticket to the game. In other words, a requirement for you to be considered a potential successor in the first place. You also really need to be cognizant of any future-oriented criteria, as I think both Tato and Lashen referred to earlier. Once you've reflected on these points, you can develop a really nice, concise set of behavioral and technical success criteria for each of the roles. And we would really put forward that this is not a wish list and a long list of various criteria that the person needs to meet. It really pays to be very specific here. And I think a top tip, and it flows from something Tato mentioned earlier, is to start this process with a really up-to-date, detailed job description per role in your mission critical list. We see it far too often where we're trying to develop success criteria based on job descriptions that are just out of date. Okay, so the next step in the process is measuring potential and performance of, as we said earlier, typically your long list of potential successes here. And you want to measure potential and performance, obviously, in relation to the success criteria that you identified in the previous step. We advocate taking a really multi-method approach and making sure that you have a method to integrate all the data back against the success criteria once you have all the data. I think I've seen this question come through, but you can use psychometric assessments to give you a really good sense of the person's potential to demonstrate the success criteria. The psychometric assessments are very useful for looking at competency potential, for example, learning agility, workplace reasoning, what motivates a person, if you think of the human catalysts that Tato shared earlier. And then on the flip side, you can use 360 surveys, experience checklists, and hard performance data to also give you objective measures of the person's performance against the success criteria. So it's a case of using comprehensive evaluation tools to gain a holistic sense of the person's fit back to the requirements of the role. Another really key aspect here is to hear from the business and to hear from the line managers and the successors themselves, taking a more subjective approach in this case, and being able to balance your objective measures with your more subjective measures. So more specifically, we use discussions with successors to actually determine whether they aspire to the critical roles in your business and the extent to which they're currently engaged. Because far too often we find that we shortlist successors who actually don't aspire to the critical roles in the first place. Okay. You can also use your discussions with the line managers to validate people's recordings of their particular experiences in an area. Okay. The top tip here is to integrate the data really well and to display integrated role fit profiles in a highly visual way and a highly interactive way to facilitate talent review discussions and succession planning discussions. Okay, so slide 4 is about selecting successors who are feasible successors. In other words, they have a really good chance of fulfilling a role within your succession timeframe. And this entails carefully reviewing the data that you have for those people in terms of the success criteria of the role to develop a depth chart, as we call it. I think Tato referred, or Lashen referred to it as your succession pipeline. Now, the depth chart provides, it should provide primary and secondary successors for management and individual contributor tracks. And here it's critically important to weave in the value of diversity and inclusion into your depth chart and to make sure that you're identifying successors who, based on their readiness level, are going to be ready to meet the requirements of the new role within your time frame. Remember, each successor you add into your project, you're going to need to budget for from a time and cost perspective, and it will just introduce complexity to your project. And given that the next step's about driving development, you want to select people who you are willing to invest significant time and effort in developing because they are highly feasible successors for the role. Typically, highly feasible successors will have 2 to 3 max technical behavioral development areas to work on. Okay. Top tip here is to be really realistic, therefore, in terms of who you include in your succession depth chart, because those are people you're going to need to be committed to a development journey with. Okay. So the last step in the process is really about driving development with your shortlisted potential successors to the roles. Here we advocate for highly personalized, person-specific, blended learning journeys. We find the 70-20-10 method works very well, where 70% of the time is focused on highly practical experiences and exposure within the business, 20% of the time on learning by having a coach accessible to you or mentor, and 10% being more kind of classroom-based learning. Concerning the mentors and coaches, it's a really good idea to pair successors with mentors who can pass on institutional knowledge, who can give the potential successor greater visibility in the business, and who can provide access to different forums where they can gain practical exposure. Okay. On the experiential learning piece, I heard some really nice suggestions from Lashen that we'll weave into our ebook for you guys, which will follow this webinar. But you can get creative here. Being in the role is not the only way to gain practical exposure to the role. We've seen companies create wonderful stretch assignments, give people leadership responsibilities, maybe for a team, for a project team, job rotations, as I mentioned earlier, access to certain forums, even just to be a fly on the wall in an exco, can be wonderful, practical experience. So our top tip here would be to actually involve the various stakeholders to the personalized development journey in the process. That could include the mentors and coaches, but is oftentimes the line manager of the potential successor, HR, and a coach, to kind of co-craft a development journey that really makes sense for the person. And we found that this helps to drive buy-in and, you know, continuous supply of resources for the learning journey. Okay, maybe a sneaky second top tip here is to try to create learning experiences that actually add value to the business. A practical example I've seen before is a potential successor to a chief revenue officer role having to create a sales strategy for the upcoming year. So for 2025, in this case, is actually going to add significant value to the business in its own right, but also give the person an opportunity to develop. Okay, so Lumenii has developed a really nice, simple model to guide planning and implementation of succession planning. The model identifies very clear success criteria for mission-critical roles and weaves together organizational perspectives, human insights from managers, potential and performance data into a coherent, holistic view of the person's fit back to the success criteria. And rolling this out in a systematic way leads to greater business continuity, higher productivity, and improved retention and engagement for your talent pool. If I've got time, I'd like to end with a short and what I found a highly inspirational anecdote around succession planning. In 2017, I think it was, roughly 2 years before the 2019 Rugby World Cup, the management of our Springbok rugby team identified that we didn't have sufficient bench strength in certain positions to go and win the World Cup, which was only 2 years ago. The management identified the critical roles and shortlisted a group of successors to those roles who didn't have sufficient experience at that point in time. They defined what success looked like in those roles in rugby terms, and they selected really diverse players to fill those roles. The key here was to have the guts to give those players exposure in the pressure cooker environment of international rugby, you know, playing in front of 80,000 people with a huge amount at stake. And the key here was that they were actually prepared to lose some games to give everybody the opportunity to gain that practical exposure. They nurtured this diverse talent, and 8 years later, we as South Africans have won 2 Rugby World Cups with those players. And some of those successes are actually now star players in the team. So I think you all agree that succession planning is really cool. It has an awesome feel-good factor to it. And I wish you guys all the best with your succession planning efforts going forward.
Thank you very much, Alvin. Appreciate that, and I appreciate the very practical thoughts and tips that you shared with the audience. So just to reiterate what Alvin referred to, we will be sharing additional information on these points in the form of an ebook so that, you know, we obviously had limited time in this session. We can provide some additional information and resources to the audience. Right, so we have just over 20 minutes to run through the Q&A, and I'd like to ask the panelists to come on camera for me. And we have a lot of interaction and questions and comments from our audience. So thank you very much, guys, for sharing those. So I'm going to direct the question to a panelist, but anyone is free to also jump in and share your experiences as well. And the first one, I'm going to pick on you, Tato. And I'm going to ask you, there have been a lot of questions about transparency, right? Transparency in the process, in terms of the recruitment process, in terms of how to communicate internally. So the question I'd like to ask you is, how much transparency should an organization have around its succession planning strategy, processes, and successor choices?
Thanks, Caitlin, and thank you to the audience for that question. I think it's very important to ask these questions, and a lot of the times we mean well, and we end up kind of messing up the process. So 100% transparency, yes, 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 that is very important. What is even more important is how we position it and what we say. So firstly, succession planning shouldn't be a project. And it also shouldn't be something that we do on the side. It should be integrated into our talent management processes, into our talent planning. And this is why at the beginning I said that when you write the job description, that's when your talent succession planning starts. So when you onboard people and you put them into certain roles, you are already doing succession planning. But that on its own is a whole separate conversation. When we talk to high potential people who, after a talent review process, have been put on that 9-grade box, as an example, it is important that we have these conversations, and how we do it is also important. So something like, between a line manager and an employee, that relationship is important because it sets the tone in how we discuss things. If we didn't get it right at the beginning, it's going to be difficult for you to come back and to tell somebody that they have high potential. So we don't label, we don't say that you have high potential, therefore you are on succession planning. Instead, we discuss the company's commitment to investing in your potential and in your growth because we see it. And therefore, we would like to discuss your career aspirations in line with the strategy and the trajectory that the company is taking. People with high potential and high performance, they know. So when you say that, automatically they will know that they are high potential, probably because of high performance, and then you start discussing the actual strategy of the company. And this is where you say the direction that we are wanting to take goes there. Where do you see yourself in the next 6 months? What opportunities can we start putting in place to grow the skills that are aligned? So it's more about the conversation than the labels. So 100% transparency, but we don't tell people that you are in box 6 or box 9, and therefore that's not what we do. We discuss investment and commitment, and that's how we become transparent. But we can't have transparency if we don't have we haven't put in the right processes in place.
No, thank you, Tato. I think that's a very good
point. Just come in.
Hmm.
Totally agree with Tato. 100% transparency is needed in this process, not only from a fairness and equality point of view, but also from a buy-in point of view. Because as soon as it's transparent to everyone sees the benefits and stuff, you're going to get in more buy-in. Some things to look at from a transparency point of view is make sure your succession plan is documented so that you have reference to go to. People question it, you've got it documented, etc. Your criteria upfront needs to be on point based on competency and potential rather than the subjective issues. And also in your succession process, include a grievance or appeal process. So if people are unhappy about how it's going about, they have an output or a channel to discuss their feelings in terms of the unfairness that they perceive with the succession plan. Thanks.
Thank you, Lashen. Yes, and I think we've also had a number of questions around how do we advertise for roles that have been part of the succession planning process, and should we advertise and should we open them up to internal or external only? Do you have any reflections on that, Lashen?
Yeah, so I think first point, it depends on what your recruitment policy within your company is. Certain companies have from a certain Patterson or Paromni's level, they're allowed to headhunt or promote internally without advertising. So that will dictate it. However, it should be made clear to any person that's on a succession process that they're not earmarked for the position. They are being developed, and if there's a need for the position, they will be considered. They still have to go through the full recruitment process. So there's no guarantee that a person on a succession plan is guaranteed the position that they are being developed in. And that needs to be clear from the outset.
I agree with that. Thank you. All right, Alvin, I'm going to direct the next question to you. So we've had a number of questions around how do we identify readiness? How do we measure potential? And I think in your discussion, you already mentioned the fact that, one can rely on objective measures such as personality, competency, potential, and agility to really measure the potential of our technical specialists. So a related question is from Elizabeth to you, Alvin, is how do you choose amongst staff to succeed to a certain position if they are at par in terms of performance, attitude, or qualifications?
I think that's a really great question. Look, there are other things that you might want to look at if they're on par in every other sense. One thing that comes to mind immediately, and if I think of Tato's presentation, is that human catalyst element. So the extent to which what motivates them and inspires them and what they aspire to, etc., is a fit to the broader environment of the business as well. So yes, role fit is incredibly important, and we know from the literature that role fit predicts success most. But it is increasingly more valuable to look at the extent to which the person fits with the broader environment and context within which they're going to operate. So I think that's one area to go and look at and possibly differentiate candidates in that regard. I think related to that is what you're looking for in the team. So you can take a slightly more macro view of it and say, well, what nice new perspectives or behaviors would we want to introduce into our business? So you've got two candidates who tick very similar boxes from a competency potential point of view, from a learning agility point of view, from a cognitive point of view. But one of them might bring a really fresh perspective to the team or some supplementary or complementary behaviors into the team. So those are potential areas that you can look at to differentiate candidates who are very close. I think maybe lastly is who wants it more. We know from the literature that it's very important to have people in the role who really want to be in the role and have energy and vitality for it. So perhaps that's a third area you could look at to differentiate candidates who are very close in terms of their ability to deliver the success criteria.
Thanks, Alvin. I'd actually like to add to that as well. So just to reflect on when we engage with organizations on succession planning, we often are dealing with a number of metrics. And what we've seen is organizations come to us and they've done the psychometrics and they've got the performance data, but there's all this data and it's often in silos. And the struggle becomes, how do we bring this together? What do we look at first? How do we make decisions? So what we often do is we will combine the data and we will weight the data in line with the success criteria, map it back to the job descriptions, the KPIs, what is required, weight it accordingly, and that then allows you to almost come up with, an overall answer, which is only a provisional answer, obviously, until you bring in the qualitative information as well. And the second point I wanted to make is, I also think if organizations are only choosing a single successor, they are bringing in an element of risk. So we often will advocate, you may have someone who's in the path for the short term, maybe 6 to 12 months development journey, but it is a good idea to have people maybe on a longer growth path for the same position, so that if one person joins or resigns or the situation changes, then you are prepared for that and you've not put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. All right. So thank you, Alvin. A related question to this, Tato, how do we develop a talent pipeline and ensure long-term commitment?
I wanna come back to performance and the whole purpose of this employer-employee relationship, and that's it. It's performance. It's nothing else. In the role, there's the specific things that must be achieved by the organization and by this role, and together, then the outcome of it is performance. And then what is performance, and how do we measure that? Because that's how we start. Everything else then branches out from what needs to be performed. And even creating that talent pipeline is that. So what are the competencies that we are looking for, either in this role or in this category? What are the skill sets that we are looking for, and how are we going to measure those? So you can be creative in how you want to do this. The whole point of it is that it needs to be uniform across the board, and uniform just means that how you do things, what it looks like in reality might differ per department, but the uniformity of it across the organization will make the process fair. And then training, coaching to managers is very important. We know that managers are technical specialists in their own right, but they're also people developers, and they're responsible for having these conversations. So the objectivity of these talent assessments and our processes will bring us halfway. And then the subjectivity of the everyday life that we don't see between the manager and the employee and the teams is also the other 50% of the qualitative subjectivity that we need. So together, your data and the performance is an observable behavior. You can't tell us how you perform. You can self-evaluate, that's good, but it does not mean that is how we have perceived your performance. We need to tell you how you are performing. And by we, your manager, your team, everybody else that you work with, and combined, those are the things. So performance is where you start. You build a talent pipeline based on what outcome are you hoping for? What does performance look like when we are successful as an organization and when we are successful in this particular role? And then you work it backwards. But before we even do anything, we put people anywhere. I am asking us as a human capital fraternity, please spend time organizing yourselves. Spend time organizing your processes. Spend time developing those processes. It takes a lot of effort and time, but once the foundation has been laid, everything else is just smooth because you put people in, and all that you do, you literally you concentrate on the experience. And that's how you do any planning. That's how you do talent planning. That's how you do succession planning. You concentrate on the experience, but build your processes right. Choose what success looks like. Choose the right criterias, and yeah, you will have yourself a good process. Spend time designing.
Thank you, Tato. I also have this vision that I communicate to organizations that succession planning shouldn't be treated as a project, but it should be treated as an ongoing and always on approach and mindset in the organization. And I'm always selling this vision that it feeds into the everyday discussions between line managers and and employees and team members. It feeds into your performance management check-ins once a quarter. And that way, I believe if it is treated as an always on process, the long-term commitment will come, and it won't be something that's pulled out of a box every 2 years to be looked at and then put away again until
Yes.
it has passed.
Can I just throw in one more thing? Then when we do that right, we don't need buy-in. We don't need anybody to buy into anything, because once it's a culture, it's our way of being. That's who we are. That's how we do things. We no longer need to go and think about buy-in. I don't like buy-in.
So actually, that
often.
was my next question, and I'm going to ask Lashen to weigh in on this. Tato, you spoke about training and workshops for managers and so on, but we all know that when we start, the buy-in is a necessary step. It's the need to get the obstacles out the way, to get champions to take the cause forward. Lashen, what are your thoughts on how we can get buy-in from senior management in these areas so that we can embed it into company culture and make it a normal process in the day-to-day work environment?
So I think the very first step is to start off with your executive team, because if there's no buy-in at that level, you're not going to get buy-in at the lower levels. And how I approached buy-in in terms of succession planning at my organization is basically exposing them to the risk of not having a succession plan and investing in succession planning. Secondly is, what is the return on investment? We all know how lengthy a recruitment process can be if we have to go externally. We all know the amount of training and money that we need to spend in terms of new recruits. So why don't we do that before the time or the need and invest in our people internally? And I think if we get those two main issues sorted out, you'll definitely get buy-in. I don't personally, from the organizations I've worked in, I don't think the buy-in is an issue at your senior and lower levels. It's more your top management executive who are so busy working on strategic initiatives that the strategy comes up once a year when board asks, what's your succession plan for your top 20 positions? And then it's just a paper exercise, not necessarily ongoing. And obviously having it on your as an agenda item, if not monthly, every 2 months, on the progress that the succession plan has taken in the company, also helps to inculcate that culture of always having it on top of mind when discussions at a strategic level are occurring.
Thank you, Lashen. What we've also seen in our experience is when the succession plan starts to yield fruit and the executives can see the appointment of senior staff or fellow executives from the succession planning process, then that also helps to make it a very real and very rewarding process for them. All right, Alvin, I'm going to direct a question to you. So we've spoken a lot about potential and how to identify potential. There was a question from Tyrell Singh. What criteria can we base our employee performance on?
In terms of potential?
In terms of performance. So what criteria can we use to basically measure employee performance?
Okay, so I think Tato mentioned something very important, that performance is observable behavior. So you're going to have a set of criteria that you've identified as important for success. And where possible, the use of, for example, a 360 survey to measure the extent to which the person's actually demonstrating the behavior in the business can be very useful. But other aspects of performance that they might need to achieve is demonstrating more technical behaviors at a higher level. And for that, a very practical way I've seen it measured in the past is through experience surveys, where you detail the very specific experience the person needs to have had, exposure to what, perhaps managing a profit and loss in a business. And you get people to self-report their experience in those areas, but have that validated and explored with line managers. So you're trying to tick two boxes. Is the person demonstrating the behaviors that we need them to show? So not just the what, the how of the next role. And are they prepared to perform certain key experiences given their previous exposures? I hope that helps.
Caitlin, if I can just come in as well. So the baseline for any performance discussion should be your JD. And it's so important to ensure that the JDs are updated on a regular basis and not just at your annual performance stage, because business revolves on a day-to-day basis. And so too can your JD. Your JD should be a living document. And the criteria set in your JD is basically the minimum criteria that you would use to measure performance. Thank you.
Thank you, Lashen. All right, so we'd like to wrap up on time and not keep anyone over 12 o'clock. So I'm going to ask one final question, and I'm going to direct it to each one of my panelists. And that question is going to be if you can share one practical idea or tip on how to develop high-performing leaders that you have found works for you. And I'm going to ask Tato first to share her answer.
I think show alignment between strategy and that person's role, and then find out from them where do they see themselves and how do they want to grow. And that's the basis. Strategy, their role, and them as a human being and how they want to grow and design, co-create from there.
Thanks, Tato. Alvin?
Yeah, I think you probably know what I'm going to say, especially in the context of a technical environment where you simply haven't had certain opportunities to demonstrate leadership behaviors, for example. Exposure is absolutely key. having the guts to allow people to gain exposure to certain experiences in a high stakes environment, and being kind of okay with the idea that there might be some failure in that regard, I think is the critical attitude to have when developing technical talent into more senior leadership roles.
Thanks, Alvin. And finally, Lashen.
So coming from the coaching environment, I would say mentoring and coaching. And very often people use those words as synonyms, but in fact, they're two very different processes. Whereas mentoring is actually guiding and counseling, etc. Your coaching is more allowing the person to come up with the actual answers to their questions rather than you giving it to them. So I definitely found that mentoring and coaching has helped cement the foundation for a successor in my organization. Thank you.
Thanks, Lashen. And thank you to our panelists for sharing your expertise and your time with us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you to the audience for joining. We will share all the resources. We will share the answers to the questions. And there will be a short survey once you exit out of Zoom if you would like to fill that in based on how you found the webinar and ideas for future sessions. So thank you and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.